Yeah, no, sounds good.
Okie doke. All right. Well, I appreciate you talking to me, Dana. Today we're talking with Dana
Pleasure.
Williams. He is an associate professor at Chico State University in California. He's got a PhD from the University of Akron. He teaches and does research in the areas of social inequality, class, gender, race, sexuality, intersectionality, social movements, political sociology, public sociology, and organizations. Teaches a lot of those classes as well. Has written a ton of scholarly peer-reviewed articles. I won't go through all of those, but has also written two books or co-written a book and written a book. One's called Black Flags and Social Movements, a sociological analysis of movement anarchism. And the other book that he co-authored with, I believe, Jeff Shantz Brill. Is that correct?
Jeff Shantz. Yep.
Jeff Shantz,
Jeff
okay.
Shantz, Canadian.
Anarchy and Society, Reflections on an Anarchist Sociology. Dana and I worked together at Valdosta State years and years ago, and I, as I hear kind of comments about anarchists and so forth, and the perception that people have about them, one of the reasons I wanted to talk with you is Dana is one of the nicest people I've ever met, one of the most ethical, one of the most generous people in my life. I consider him a dear friend. And so this is just an effort for folks to hear from somebody who identifies with anarchism firsthand, instead of, kind of hearsay about it. So I appreciate you talking with me and letting me record you and record our conversation.
My pleasure.
I guess the first jumping off point is if I could just get you to tell me a little bit about what anarchism is and what are some of the kind of misperceptions about it.
Sure. Anarchism, I think, means a lot to different people. There's a joke amongst anarchists that if you ask 3 anarchists to define anarchism, you'll get 4 or 5 or more definitions of them. That there's not not necessarily a strong consensus, but there are some central values that have been around ever since the kind of modern period of anarchism from the kind of the mid 1800s. Although some historians will go back further and say that you can find connections with anarchist thought going back into antiquity. There's anthropologists who study sort of so-called primitive or early societies and talk about how they had very anarchistic social structures. And many of them make the argument that for most of humanity, we lived in a fairly anarchistic state, not one of chaos, but one in which there is rough egalitarianism and cooperation and kind of self-management of people's lives and so forth. But the modern period of anarchism really starts in the mid 1800s and quickly kind of dovetails with the Industrial Revolution and people realizing that they were losing control of their old traditional lifestyles, capacities. You kind of see the loss of worker control over people's occupations or their crafts, and kind of this pushback throughout Europe, but also because this is also the time of colonialism, that it's also happening throughout the world too. Latin America, Asia, the Middle East, kind of all over the place, this kind of stuff is happening. And from the very origins, anarchism borrowed from both the liberal tradition and the radical tradition. Liberal in that they believed in individual freedom. I mean, today in the United States, we talk about individual freedom as being a conservative ideal, but it very much is a liberal in the sense of liberal individual freedoms. And it borrowed from that, as well as from what was starting to be called the radical tradition of resistance to industrial capitalism, which mostly at the time meant like socialists and communists and people kind of affiliated with the ideas of Karl Marx and so forth. But the anarchists kind of walked the line between liberals and radicals. In fact, throughout most of the world today, anarchists also go by the names of libertarian socialists, that they borrowed from the so-called libertarian tradition of individual freedom and empowerment and autonomy, as much as they borrowed from the socialists or radical traditions of economic and social justice, of worker revolution, and things like that. So they would critique. In fact, one of the more famous anarchists, a guy named Bakunin, a Russian anarchist, said that, and I'm going to screw up my paraphrase of it, but he said that socialism without liberty is brutality and injustice, or slavery, whereas liberty without equality is just like it's just cruelty to people. Like you can't have one without the other. And so anarchists very much view their they view their lives, they view their aspirations, the future world they'd like to be part of creating, as having to empower people collectively, but also individually. That we have to have justice as well as liberty, and to sacrifice one for the other is just absurd.
Gotcha.
And so kind of fighting for both at the same time.
Yeah. Well, you said there's not kind of one set definition, right? Or at least that's what I think you said. If you're talking to the everyday person on the street and they were to ask you kind of what are some of the key principles or pillars of kind of an anarchist position, what would those be?
Sure. Probably one of the central ones that most anarchists would agree with is anti-authoritarianism. The idea that at the end of the day, you know what's best for yourself. That you should be the one who, because first off, it is your life, and you make choices in your life, and any choice you make will affect you primarily. That you shouldn't be bossed around, ordered around, dictated to by other kind of people who stand in as authorities over you. It doesn't mean not all anarchists necessarily reject all authority, but they have an anti-authoritarianism, which is critical of and challenging of authority. And some anarchists say, well, if you can justify authority, then maybe it's okay. There maybe are some instances in which you could imagine authority being helpful, like the kind of exertion of someone else's dominance. But in most
like
cases,
if somebody were an expert in something,
yeah,
you didn't have expertise in.
Yeah. Although it kind of depends on how you define authority. If authority is just people having expertise or skills that you don't have, well, you don't necessarily have to listen to that. I mean, again, Bakunin, this kind of famous anarchist I was mentioning, said that in matters of shoemaking, I refer to a cobbler because a shoemaker knows how to make a shoe. But at the end of the day, I'm the one who has to wear the shoe, so I can reject the cobbler's designs. I mean, if I want to walk around wearing a crappy shoe, that's my right to do so. But why wouldn't I listen to a cobbler? Because they know how to do it. Gotcha. But they shouldn't have authority over me at the end of the day. Gotcha. So I mean, so anti-authoritarianism is one of those ideas. It doesn't mean that people shouldn't listen to their parents, or doesn't mean we shouldn't have, structures above us that do kind of coordinate how we act. But it means that you shouldn't do things just because other people go like demand that you do them. Like it should be justified, and you should be convinced of its justness, or otherwise it should be abolished. And I think most anarchists would argue that most forms of authority that exist in society today either don't need to exist, or there could be a better form of them that are more egalitarian, more liberatory, that could probably be more efficient too.
Yeah. When you say egalitarian, like I know what those words mean, or libertarian, or like translate that. What does that look like in somebody's life?
Yeah. Well, I think egalitarianism for the most part means that people who are living in a community together, or are working with each other, or you're in a family with someone, that you should mostly find yourself on kind of an even plane with them, that they should have an equal voice, they should have equal resources, they should have an equal amount of opportunity, but also hopefully equal outcomes, or equal potential for outcomes. That it shouldn't be that one person is hogging all of the attention, all of the time. I mean, it shouldn't be one person who talks through the entire conversation. Other people should be able to share and listen as well as talk. You shouldn't have one person in the household who is the one who chooses like who gets to eat and who doesn't get to eat, or something like that. Egalitarianism is something we practice all the time with our friends. Like, I mean, if you have friends, like real friends, you don't like tell them what to do, and you don't steal or take things from them, or say, I'm not going to borrow you or lend you this thing because I don't trust you. No, you like being in a relationship with those people. You've chosen them. And so you act in an egalitarian way. You share, you cooperate, you engage in like a give and take with them, because it gives you pleasure, right? You enjoy it. So egalitarianism is usually the idea of kind of sharing resources, sharing power, sharing social status, but it's also something that I think that humans typically find good, right? I mean, there's all these positive outcomes in how it makes people feel, as opposed to when there's inequity, when there's injustice, or when there's inequality between resources. The people who have all the resources are paranoid. They're worried and fearful that people are going to steal things from them. Whereas the people who lack them are desperate and are trying to kind of hustle to like fill in the gaps, on a day-to-day basis to get their needs met. Whereas with egalitarianism, we can kind of relax a bit more. We can kind of, the argument I think that anarchists have is that it would make society better. Like we'd be happier people as opposed to being fearful and paranoid and distrustful. And, I mean, that's good for us in any number of ways. I mean, it's good for our health, good for our mental health. It's good for, our sense of safety and security. I mean, we don't have to have locked doors every time, we go to sleep or whatever. We can, we can exist in a more peaceful and happy way.
Gotcha. Well, that has deep implications for almost every job in the United States. I mean, where
Sure,
I guess
sure.
this is what you're saying. So I'm assuming that folks wouldn't be real cool with selling your labor to somebody. For example, most businesses, you have an owner that's one or two people, or it's a corporation, right? And everybody is basically making them money, right?
Yeah,
Everybody else's
yeah.
job is to produce a profit for them, right? And they take the bounty of everybody else's labor, and generally are
Mhm.
not very generous about sharing whatever profits and resources when
Yeah.
there's windfalls. And I mean, so I mean, is that a fair criticism of how people would see our what we call work? The typical
Sure.
job,
Yeah.
whether it's in
Yeah.
a university
Yeah.
or anywhere else.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that anarchists, but to be honest, like lots of people in society have critiques of the economic system. I mean, I think a lot of people, and not just anarchists, don't like a lot about what we have to do. I mean, basically, our economy is kind of an economy based on light coercion. I mean, maybe not sometimes even light coercion, sometimes rather aggressive coercion. Not that people force people by gunpoint to work, but survival does,
Yeah.
or
Work
the
or
need
die.
to eat does.
Yeah.
So yeah, work or die, and especially when there's no social security or safety net, or if you don't have a family that can support you. And as a consequence, I think that for anarchists, the idea is that an economy doesn't have its own um, an economy shouldn't have rights itself. An economy doesn't have purpose. I mean, it only exists insofar as it helps people and serves people. That, I mean, the idea that I think that like free market capitalist thinkers have is that the 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 market or capitalism is natural in some way, and there's something very almost like biological about how it acts.
Yeah.
And anarchists reject that idea, saying that it's not natural, it's created by people, mainly by people who had power to begin with, and they set it up in a way that it would benefit them. Whereas anarchists said, well, it's very easy to construct things differently. Many anarchists have historically been part of cooperative projects, which, by the way, look a lot of times like companies or businesses otherwise. They sell things, they maybe engage in marketplace activities, but everything internally is organized in a to use that word again, in an egalitarian fashion. Oftentimes in cooperatives, everybody is paid the same salary. So it's not like one group of people gets more money and also more power and influence.
Is it also
Everyone
fair?
kind of shares it.
Yeah. Is it also fair to say, because my thought has always been that if people have a stake in the company as
Yeah,
co-owners, they make sure people don't steal. They make sure people pull their weight, you
yeah,
know.
sure. Yeah.
And it's only when you have situations where people are in these hierarchies and they know they're a peon, they know they're not going to be paid well, they know they're expendable and not valuable, that they steal. They have
Yeah, sure.
no right. They have no investment in making
Yeah,
the company or store or whatever it is actually function well.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
I mean, it's under those conditions that people I mean, like you said, they lose interest in it and they don't feel committed to it. We're going to have shoplifting happening at higher rates. There's people who want to, call in sick all the time because they don't want to go to work. But if you feel like you're committed to something together and you're benefiting equally, you also feel kind of on the line with it. You feel on the hook, or to use the metaphor, like you feel like everything's on the line together with others.
Right.
And so you do want to participate and you do want to cooperate. You benefit from it directly, as opposed to just earning money for the person who happens to own the business, but to be honest, might not really do that much.
Yeah.
They may just have had an idea
does.
at one point,
Yeah.
and they just kind
of
of
just inherited it.
Right, which is,
yeah.
If you look at the Forbes 400, the 400 richest people in the United States, about half them do not have occupations.
Right.
It is inherited wealth, straight up.
Yeah.
And then that's one of the critiques I think anarchists have, is that the idea that kind of capitalist ideology being kind of the idea that ideas will dominate and that people kind of believe them. Capitalism kind of preaches the idea that people deserve what they get, whereas, I mean, if everyone, and again, if you work hard, you'll survive and you'll make it. But if that's the case, I mean, what are all these rich people, doing? I mean, like stockbrokers, for example. I mean, like, what are they actually contributing to the economy? Right. Or if it was all about hard work, I mean, as George Monbiot had said, that if hard work made people millionaires, then every woman in Africa would be a billionaire. Right. Like if it was all about hard work and sacrifice, we'd have a lot more millionaires, but it's clearly not the case. So there's something about the economy that benefits people who already have privileges, who have advantages, and for other people it provides disadvantage. And anarchists argue that it doesn't have to be this way. It's not natural. It's not.
Well, most people don't realize that capitalism, as we know, it's maybe 2.5 centuries old.
Yeah.
It's not that old of an economic system.
Right. And I think people don't necessarily even understand like what early capitalist thinkers argued or thought. Right. I mean, people have really very little conception of what Adam Smith even wrote about. Adam Smith being the kind of main author of this book called The Wealth of Nations, which, to be honest, the Wall Street Journal editorials like quote almost every other week for some weird reason. Right. There's like one line in the whole book that talks about the invisible hand of the market. One line in like a multi-100-page book. I mean, it's really, it's bewildering almost, like how much weight is sort of put into these ideas that are just old, and that were very theoretical at the time too. And a lot of people have sort of accepted them as doctrine or dogma.
Or natural, I think.
Yeah, it's not or natural.
Yeah. So anti-authoritarianism, which is really a rejection of kind of oppression or abuse in some ways, right? Or unfair power. Egalitarianism. Are there other kind of pillars?
Sure. Yeah. For anti-authoritarianism, I would also point to, usually it's about structures of hierarchy and domination in various institutions. So from its origins in the 1800s, usually anarchists were opposed to kind of like a 3-part system of power that they saw, mainly in Europe. Kind of the burgeoning nation state, who would be involved in drafting them to fight wars and so forth. The kind of industrial capitalism, but also early organized religion too. So there was a strong critique of the influence of the Catholic Church and Protestantism too. But interestingly enough, not so much about the religious ideas, although there was that, and many anarchists identify in non-religious terms, but also kind of the human-made structures of religion primarily, and how they often had anti-social impulses, especially around women, and other kinds of kind of cultural practices that led people to kind of suppress themselves and who they were. That part is still there, but the kind of anti-capitalism and anti-state characteristics are very much still around, and they've been incorporated with very much anti-patriarchal and anti-white supremacist orientations as well as anti-bureaucracy and anti-militarism and all sorts of other things that are huge influences in our lives and affect us in lots of ways. Yeah. So anti-authoritarianism is a very broad kind of thing. Cooperativism or egalitarianism is another kind of thing, which speaks to the ways in which we can do things differently. So as opposed to hierarchy and domination through authority, instead it advocates for cooperating and an egalitarian social relationship and working on what Latin American anarchists usually called horizontalism or horizontalidad, that as opposed to a vertical orientation, we work up chains of command. We're kind of looking at everyone else and saying, you're an equal you may not know as much as me, or I may know less than you. We may have different experiences, but we're each worthy of being on the same plane. We're each worthy of speaking. We're each worthy of contributing. We're each worthy of certain basic rights that we should respect for each other.
Gotcha.
So that's one part of it. And one other last one, if you want another one to think about, is the idea of self-management. That at the end of the day, workers and citizens and community members should mostly be involved in doing the things that they need to be doing for themselves and for their communities. And the biggest example is worker self-management. That, for instance, for your job or for my job, that I know how to do my job. I don't really need someone telling me how to do it. If I can be trusted to do my job, things work good at the place that I work at. Or like when I'm at home, like at my house, like with my partner or other household members, we can share responsibilities, and I can be trusted to do the dishes, and I can be trusted to clean the floors, I can be trusted to tend to our garden. I can trust other people to do that too. And we can kind of choose how to do it. And we can coordinate, but at the end of the day, like I should be the one in control of my life, as opposed to someone else saying, hey, Dana, you need to do it this way, or you need to do it this way. And when you introduced me, you mentioned that I'm a professor. Professors are some of the few people in American society that are sort of entitled to, and it's kind of built into our job contract that we have self-management. No one has ever told me how to teach my classes. Literally nobody.
Yeah.
Not a dean, not a university president, not other teachers. No one's ever come up to me and said, hey, you really need to teach statistics this way. I teach statistics. No one's ever said, hey, you need to teach about social movements in this way. People just trust me to do it. And I feel the responsibility to do a good job with it. And I feel that if I can kind of live up to my own expectations, I'll be living up to other people's expectations too.
Well, that doesn't mean you're not evaluated though, right? Because I can hear conservative voices in my head going,
sure.
You're going to abuse that, right?
Right. It doesn't mean that we're not evaluated. We're judged every semester by students. Students write evaluations of our classes. Our peers will evaluate us. But also universities have a system of tenure, which means that after a certain number of years, you can be granted mostly, indefinite, renewals of your contract. Barring that you do something illegal or you kind of relinquish, your responsibilities, which, people do sometimes, and they are fired. But the idea of tenure is sort of that, well, we put a certain amount of trust into you. And after you kind of show that you can do it, well, we kind of believe you now. It's kind of like a long-term friend you might have. You have a friend for, a couple of weeks, you may not quite know how to trust them, but after the months go by, the years go by, you kind of know them, and you kind of, they may not be always on their game, but they can be trusted at the end of the day to do things. I think anarchists, especially there are some anarchists who are academics like me, and we universally argue that we shouldn't be the only ones with self-management opportunity. We also shouldn't be the only ones granted tenure. You can think about most jobs in the United States that people, after they've done their job for a certain amount of time, they probably know how to do it pretty well. They don't need their boss hanging around and pointing things out. They're pretty efficient at it. In fact, a lot of times managers haven't necessarily done those jobs before. They just know about them intellectually. And all they really have is kind of the authority over them to tell them how to do things, which may not even be very practical knowledge.
Yeah.
And the same thing for tenure. Like, why shouldn't someone who's done their job for 5 years kind of be guaranteed to keep that job into the future? I know there's practical problems with that, but a lot of times workers are very afraid for their jobs and their lives, therefore, because it could be lost in a moment. And think about what that would mean if there was stability and security. If people didn't have to worry about calling in sick if they're going to lose their job. Lots of American workers go to their jobs sick, even despite the pandemic, because they're worried about if they don't do that, they're going to lose their jobs.
Well, how do you respond
like
to?
Idea.
Yeah, because again, I'm moving conservative circles and come from a conservative family. What do you say to, because it almost feels like there's different theories of human nature, right? Because
Yeah.
I can hear these voices in the back of my head going, well, if we
Yeah.
give workers that much freedom, they're going to abuse it.
Yeah.
And I imagine what you would probably say, and correct me if I'm wrong, is, well, if they're equally valued, have a stake in it, have responsibility, and they're accountable,
Mhm.
that kind of takes care of itself. Is that fair?
Yeah, of course, definitely. I mean, a good comparison to make is if we were talking about, say, workers at a workers' cooperative, workers who kind of co-own and co-manage their workplace and whatever they're doing. Think about how you can kind of create an analogy with people who own or rent a house. People who own the house feel responsible for it, and responsible to other people maybe who own the mortgage with them. Like, I mean, if it's a married couple, I mean, maybe it's the husband and wife. Well, they feel kind of accountable to each other for it. They feel accountable to the people who live there. They're going to keep the house up. They'll repair problems with it. Whereas if you rent a house, the landlord is perhaps only insofar as you pressure them inclined to make repairs, because, hey, if it's one of those tight rental markets, they can rent it for a lot of money. Why make expensive repairs?
Right.
Whereas if I mean, again, by the way, this is like arguments that go back like long period in American society. I mean, we're talking about, I mean, your podcast Going South. I lived with you for 4 years in the South. These arguments date back to slavery.
Yeah.
I mean, there was an argument that Southerners had about the kind of emerging industrial capitalist system in the North. And there were voices in the South, intellectuals, who said, you Northerners, all you do is rent people. You just rent people. You rent their lives and you dispose of them. You don't care about them. Whereas we have human relations with our slaves. And they didn't mean it necessarily in a sexual way. What they were saying was that, like, we live next to them, we interact with them, we talk with them, we respect them, we care for them, because if they fall sick and die, it's on our backs, so to speak, economically or otherwise. And by the way, that's a horrifying argument taken to its
Yeah, I
logical.
was fixing to say, you need to clarify that you're not.
Yeah, but that's the argument that they had,
Yeah.
And there's something to that idea, and that's why people would call wage
slavery,
wage slavery, because they associated with it.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, I mean, anarchists say, well, they're very similar in a sense. I mean, slaves were only valuable insofar as they made money.
They were productive
for the master, And to be honest, there was all this brutality to get that to happen. And then you can say there's sort of a version of that exists in our economy today. You're not in legal bondage, but you're in bondage through debt. You're in bondage through, your pressure to eat the next meal. You're in your bondage in terms of paying your
for medical care,
right? Yeah, right. Or supporting your family, your kids, and so forth. I mean, I don't think conservatives are wrong to say that humans can be pretty terrible, right? I mean, I think, again, slavery is a great example of that. Anarchists will make a number of arguments in juxtaposition to that. The main argument being that hierarchy brings that out in us.
Yeah,
being in hierarchical systems makes everyone sort of like that. Yeah. It makes the managers, the owners, or the slave masters, it makes them brutal because they're trying to control. And so they do things that, they wouldn't necessarily do to their families, for example, or they wouldn't do to their friends. And the same thing is for the people who are on the bottom of the system too, that they're desperate. Yeah. And they cut corners and they act illicitly. They backstab each other. They're desperate, right? And sometimes that leads to all sorts of kind of deviance and wrongdoing and criminality. But again, the argument that anarchists have is it's because it's happening in this very unequal system that drives people to extremes. Yeah. And to find a more kind of functional society, a society that works better, we wouldn't expect that much. I mean, most of the crime that happens in the United States is what we call property crime. And a lot of it's happening because people don't have resources, right?
Yeah. Well, that, and, one of the things I remember from...
Mark, can I very briefly stop you?
Yeah.
My cat wants out of the room.
Yeah, go ahead.
Bye, Jenny. You can leave that in your podcast if you like to. But
oh yeah, I will. Yeah, I'm not into it. I'm too lazy. The thing I've often thought about in terms of the arguments against hierarchy that made a lot of sense to me was also when you start giving people titles and roles, right, that are different, that are unequal in terms of power, you're really encouraging people to dehumanize one another because they begin to identify with the role and forget you see it when two friends start working somewhere and somebody gets promoted, right? And they're now a middle manager, and then they start treating their friend fundamentally differently. Relationships end, all of that. So
yeah. And that's probably been around for most of human history, I bet. But the question is, how much can we kind of acknowledge our differences and that we are not the same, but also respect people in those differences? And those titles make it harder to do that. I mean, like saying yes, sir, or your honor, or master, or father, or whatever else it might be. That those things, but those things kind of like, it creates a little bit of a distance. And it's not to say that it's to not acknowledge that that exists. It's not to say that we're going to ignore that we have differences, or that even there are different forms of power, but that those things clearly matter. Like the words we use matter, right? I mean, walk around and talk to your friends saying yes, sir, after you talk to them. They're gonna be like, what the hell's wrong with you? Like, why are you saying yes, sir? I'm not your boss. But in other instances, people saying sir at the end of like a sentence or at the end of a request is not only legitimate, but also demanded often. And why would we want more of that in our lives? You can get respect without having to have these honorific titles.
So how does all of this fit into American society? And is anarchism a threat to American society? Because I think that's the perception. I don't think people, I think people have no deep understanding of what it is, right? Again, it's just a buzzword that gets used to really, this gets weaponized and used against people. But like, so in terms of American society and what we assume is normal with corporate capitalism, like, how does this mesh with that?
I would say that probably at like every stage of US, if not earlier, American history, there have been anarchistic elements, or people who would today, we would, if there was the language for it at the time, would have perhaps have identified as anarchists. Going back to the original peoples of the Americas, the original peoples of the Americas often lived anarchistically. Not always, and it depended on nation, it depended on tribe, it depended on various things, but some of the earliest settlers in the United States, white settlers, were what were kind of identified with the radical Reformation. So they were people who were very much anti-authoritarian. Some of them like ended up creating some pretty abominable stuff in the United States, like supporting the slave trade, but in many ways they had anti-authoritarian tendencies in regards to their faiths, in regards to their Christianity. Throughout the slave experience in the Americas, there have been not only Black, but also whites who flaunted, one of the most brutal elements of hierarchy that you can imagine, just long-term, lifelong enslavement. And again, the language wasn't really around at the time, but you can imagine all sorts of people who were involved in slave uprisings, or what today we might call, sort of called white race traders, who supported Black African slaves in their uprisings, who had anti-authoritarian tendencies and often worked to, once gaining their freedom, acted in incredibly egalitarian ways. A good example of that is actually there are places in like the Okefenokee, there's places in Florida. I mean, when Florida was Spanish held, there were what
I think Fort Pillow.
Right. There are these places that basically were like maroon communities. That's what people call them. Historians call them maroons, places where slaves would run away to. And initially they were supported by the indigenous. So like, in Georgia, it was, Cherokee folks, Creek, and whites who ran away too. So white indentured servants would run away there. And all the records we have of those communities are that they are incredibly egalitarian, that they squashed racial disputes very quickly for the most part. And they function in an incredibly collaborative economy. And they work to defend themselves cooperatively as well, which is really interesting. And again, it's not anarchist per se, but there's incredible echoes of anarchism in that period. Before, again, if anarchism is kind of an industrial revolution era kind of thing, it's before that period. But anarchists, I think, also have a huge part to play in the post-Civil War period in the US. In fact, anarchism in America is pretty influential for anarchism throughout the world, and that we had a lot of the very large dramatic events that influenced anarchist history here. Probably the biggest one is a general strike that happened in Chicago in 1886 that today we call the Haymarket Affair. And that was where workers, mostly who were immigrants, mostly German immigrants, went on a strike to demand what we today call the 8-hour day. And I mean, that seems like it's just kind of an accepted idea today, even though Americans do overwork and many of us work more than 40 hours a week. It's kind of accepted that there is a 40-hour work week. At the time, it was a radical idea. I mean, it was incredibly radical because people work 10, 12, 14 hours a day. And these immigrants,
6 and 7 days a week too.
right. So yeah, the math really adds up real quick. And
we're talking children. We're also talking children.
Yeah, absolutely. Before child labor laws and companies very deliberately also employing women and girls because they viewed those girls as more submissive and more easily bossed around. And all the sexual harassment and assault that kind of goes along with all of that, of course, was present. And since, I mean, it's always the case that immigrants usually fall on the bottom end of every hierarchy. So in this case, immigrants in Chicago, Polish, German immigrants were always on the bottom of the barrel. They were kind of the most active people trying to change the economy there. They went on strike and very quickly were confronted by the Chicago Police Department, who were receiving bonuses. In fact, they also were receiving guns paid for by some of the wealthiest Chicagoan executives. Like they actually bought them a large Gatling gun to use on workers. So I mean, the very close connection between kind of this early law enforcement and the very wealthy, is a good example in Chicago. After about 3 days or so, police shot and killed a bunch of workers. The workers the next day showed up at a rally. Police charged the rally and a bomb exploded in the ranks of police, killing a number of them. And the city of Chicago, in response, arrests the 8 kind of leading anarchist figures in Chicago, puts them on trial, convicts all of them of murder, even though there's no evidence that any of them did it. Only a few of them were actually there on that day when that happened. One was standing on the stage giving a speech, so he clearly didn't do it. A couple of them weren't even on speaking terms with each other. They were disagreeing with each other, so it's not like there was a conspiracy afoot or anything. They sentenced 5 of them to death. One, the night before his execution, bites down on a dynamite cap that he smuggled in, killing himself. The other 4 hang. It wasn't very long after that the other 3 are given pardons by the governor, saying it was a travesty of justice, that you're convicting people of ideas, and in this case, worse, the aspirations of self-improvement, and how more American could that be? This is where the idea of a Labor Day comes from. So after that, people throughout the world start celebrating Labor Day on the day that this strike happened, on May 1st. And it spread throughout the world. I mean, every country in the world has a Labor Day that gets dated back to American anarchism, except the United States. We have a special Labor Day that was moved during kind of the McCarthy period to distance Labor Day from radicalism during the time of the Soviet Union. But so, I mean, there are those moments in US history where there's a very active anarchist movement that is very much usually involved in working class movements. And a lot of times, to be totally honest, white working class movements, white people who are farmers, poor workers, unemployed people, by the way, who are kind of the base of the conservative movement today. Many of their, and I would say our ancestors, I mean, speaking as 2 white people, it's people like us who are kind of the heart and soul of those anarchist movements at the time. People who were usually often early immigrants from that time period. So it's very much entwined with American history. And when you said that it becomes kind of a scare word to throw around, I don't know what the word you used for it was.
Well, I mean, I think it's a buzzword to stop conversations, to totally dismiss whole groups of people. And I guess that goes back to my question about all these ideas seem to me to be a threat to much of what our nation is kind of built on, though. And in some fundamental way, we're talking about people sharing, some things we learned as children that we seem to forget as we get older, right? That we should help each other out. And at some point, I'd like you to talk about mutual aid stuff, but they seem like very moral ideas, but it's at the same time, it's very clear that a lot of people see what they think anarchism is as an utter threat to the American way of life. I mean, and is that a fair critique in some way?
Sure. Yeah. And I think that that to the extent to which anarchism is labeled as radical, it's both totally completely accurate and true, but also really misleading, because I don't think we understand what we mean by radical. The idea of America at the very beginning was really radical. I mean, the US has one of the oldest constitutions in the world. At the time, people were like, what in the world are you talking about? Creating like different branches of government? Why wouldn't you want a monarch? I mean, it just seems like madness. I mean, it's a radical idea at the time. I mean, with all its flaws that we can see from today. So, I mean, it is radical, but I think radical at its heart, the prefix rad means root, like to get to the root of something is radical. So it speaks to having values. And a lot of American values are very much in sync with anarchism. Not all of them, but many of them. The idea of liberty and of freedom, and it totally depends on how we define those terms, but I think a lot of early anarchists were very, very much at peace with the kind of the abstract idea of America. If America really is about liberty and justice and the right to
the pursuit of happiness,
I mean, what a wonderfully aspirational idea, right? I mean, there's very little I think that anarchists would take umbrage with that or argue against. It's really kind of in where, as they say, the rubber meets the road, like really how that's applied. Early anarchists.
But don't you think that the folks that wrote it meant it, but they meant it for them?
Yes, yes,
it wasn't meant for everybody else, right?
Yeah,
it was for them.
Yeah, although like throughout American history, everyone else at one point or another has said, "Hey, those great ideas that you said into
we want some of that.
Those great words, we'd like to be part of that club too." And slowly, many, or if not most of those groups have at least gotten formal permission to join it. But you're right, from the very beginning, they may have said liberty and justice for all, but of course, all was a very
should have been for us
narrowed definition. I mean, to be totally honest, we're talking about men primarily. That's half the population. We're talking about property owners.
Yeah.
I mean, at the time, not only could people without property not vote, but even then, you couldn't even vote for the Senate directly.
Right.
That was, I mean, the Senate was always designed to be more of an elite body, kind of like the House of Lords in England, who are the gentry, the aristocrats. And later on, that was changed, but obviously in terms of race too. From one of the earliest acts of the U.S. Congress was the Naturalization Act that said that when people come to the United States, they will, I mean, they didn't put in these terms, but basically people will be defined by their race.
Yeah.
If they can be considered white, then they can become citizens. But everyone else, no. And there's like multi-generational struggles for different groups of people to be defined legally as white. I mean, it seems ridiculous to think about today, but lots of people who today would be called white were not considered white at every moment of US history. And it didn't mean that they were treated as poorly as Indians or blacks were, but it meant that they weren't fully entitled to citizenship and its rights like everyone else. So yeah, there's kind of this laying down these great ideas. They meant it for themselves, right? But over time, people have kind of chipped away at it and said, well, that should apply to everybody, right? But there's lots of historians who say that that's one reason why the United States is so conservative versus a lot of our closest peers, because we had kind of the most original and earliest constitution, and we have not really fundamentally changed. We've amended it over time, but the same structure is basically like an 18th century structure, and we're living in the 21st century. So it's old in many regards. I mean, it speaks to a different era, an era in which the people who are crafting it were overwhelmingly slave owners, or were involved in some way benefiting from the slave trade. So, I mean, the Northerners were obviously beneficiaries of it, even though they might not have owned slaves themselves. So there's a disconnect between the abstract idealism of some of it and how those values are applied in practice. I mean, again, most people, even like slave owners, I mean, at the end of the day, you have to imagine that slave owners did have nice characteristics to them. I mean, they probably were nice to their families in certain regards. They carried on. They probably could even be egalitarian in some regards to their slaves, but at the end of the day, they were slave owners, and they kept people in bondage. And I think what anarchists often are constantly going back to is, yes, there's good in all of us, but to the extent to which we're involved in bad things, we should find ways of reducing that. We should find ways of reducing, minimizing, and veering off in a different direction. I think most anarchists are fairly optimistic about our human potential, but have no illusions about the ways in which there's inertia in society. Kind of like, I mean, with physics, like an object will go and stay in motion unless it's pushed up against with friction. The same thing with society. Like it's going to go in one direction until people push against it. In the case of, like, say, race relations, it was the abolitionist movement and runaway slaves and insurrectionary slaves who pushed against it. There's no reason to suspect that slavery probably would have ended any earlier on its own. It took people pushing up against it
Right.
and saying, there's other ways of us living, even though we are different. Past crimes of our forefathers aside, but we should find ways of living better.
Well, I guess the question, kind of to bring it to the 21st century, like why do you think so few folks, why there's so few anarchists? Like, again, why aren't these ideas? Because if you actually listen to this from somebody, folks will go, well, that sounds kind of nice. What do you think is the barrier for people wanting something different, and pursuing something different?
Yeah. Part of it, I mean, at least the stuff that explicitly pertains to the label anarchism or anarchist, I think it's that words have baggage to them. That, I mean, throughout US history, anarchism has been a curse word. It has been something that has been associated with bomb throwing, even though there's been, I could count on the number of times that anarchists have tried assassinating people, heads of state or, CEOs or whatever. I mean, it's happened, but I mean, compared to what Democrats and Republicans have done, it pales in comparison. I mean, the Republican and Democratic parties have waged wars where millions of people have died. To say anarchists are the violent ones is a little bit misleading, but it's what people know about anarchism, that anarchists are violent. They're the ones who go into the streets and they fight with cops and so forth. And to be honest, most anarchists don't. I mean, 98% of the life of an anarchist is not about fighting. I mean, in the sense that you think about it, I mean, it maybe struggle for a better life, but most of it's talking to people and talking about ideas, what they think is important, talking about our values, trying to make things a little bit better, trying to organize better ways of doing things that live up to our values. And like I think you're hinting at, a lot of people do this anyways, and they do it without having the anarchist label to it. And I'm one of those anarchists who I don't think that you need to have everyone identifying as anarchists who act that way. I'm happy to work with anyone who, who doesn't want to boss me around, who doesn't want to be bossed around. Anyone who wants to cooperate, anyone who kind of wants to live egalitarianly, anyone who doesn't want to rely on racist or sexist or classist tropes and stereotypes to get along in life. Yeah, those people are cool. I'm happy to work with them. And by the way, that's the most of the population, most of the time. It just happens to be that day in and day out, we're living our lives in certain ways where there is that inertia that bring us back to our job where we have a boss, or it means that we're having to buy the things that we need at a store, or it means that we, for people who are students.
Well, I mean, can we get into the pragmatics of that? Because when you say that, that's the only way we can conceptualize it, right?
Yeah.
So what
do you mean?
Well, I think the thing about capitalist ideology and any ideological system is that it's not just that it controls how we think and feel. It also limits what we can imagine.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. And we haven't really talked about hegemony, but I think people, because of that, have a hard time imagining a different way to live.
Yeah.
And it's not really. I'm amazed at how difficult it is. I remember living here years ago and saying, why don't we share property? Or why don't we, instead of us all having an individual phone plan, let's one of us get a phone plan and add each other as family members. I mean, just monetarily, it makes sense. Why do we have to have 5 lawnmowers? Why do we, really, for me, it just always felt we were digging this financial hole by purchasing a bunch of stuff we could often share, including vehicles and other things, right? That then kind of limits what we do, and we have to trade our life literally at a place of employment for cash to buy all that stuff, right?
Yeah.
But even liberal folks, I think those suggestions, I think number one, if our items are a part of our identity and our status in this society, right? I think it's hard to do something different. And then there's just the issue of trust. You know, can I trust you to pull your end of the bargain, right?
Yeah.
So I,
Yeah.
and at the same time, I've seen it on small levels. I mean, I've experienced with you and Suzanne. I know other folks who share resources and look out after each other. In some ways, we would just call it being good neighbors.
Yeah.
It's not super complicated, even though we use jargon, right, a lot of times. But again, I just wonder why it's such. Well, I kind of know the answer to this. I think why it's such a threat, right, and has to be kind of stamped out. But you know, I mean, just and let me say one more thing, and then I'll hush. But corporate capitalism in particular, the idea that we're going to have a society where we're fundamentally selling our lifetime to somebody or some organization that does not really care about us. That we are literally just a resource to be used until we're used up, right? And not only that, as we go about our day and buy things and sell things, we're constantly trying to exploit each other. You know, by selling it at the highest price, by trying to, you know, and again, that goes into because I want to buy stuff to set myself apart from you. That all of that doesn't sound like the makings of a healthy society that can hold together indefinitely, right? That won't consume itself at some point on small levels and as well as maybe on a macro level, right? But there does seem to be a real fear. I've encountered it with people I love of doing something different that will actually liberate us and give us more time to do. I think some of us are so afraid of having free time. If we did something different, we wouldn't know what to do because we are so identified with working for some authority figure. You know, and in a place where people think God is the ultimate authority figure, it's kind of a mirror of that in the economic system, right? That well, this is the way it's supposed to be because I believe in this authority figure that's supernatural, that knows everything, that's judging me, right? So why wouldn't work look like that too? Why wouldn't family look like that too?
I think those are, I mean, those are obviously the most practical criticisms of anarchism. That anarchism does have lots of really nice, wonderful ideas, and most people when they hear it, they're like, well, that sounds like a wonderful place, but like it wouldn't work, or I can't see any sense of things moving in that direction. And I think that's 100% a great kind of observation to make about how we typically think about those ideas. You mentioned the word hegemony a minute ago, so maybe it might even be nice to kind of comment on what that is. I mean, hegemony, or when you usually use the word like hegemonic, it's so big, it's almost as if you miss what it is. It's like it fills in the whole screen. Like you don't even notice it because it's just everything. It's kind of like a fish in water. Like fish don't ponder whether or not they're in the water because like what other kind of world is there for a fish? I mean, that's kind of what capitalism is. That's kind of what the state is. For so many people, that's the world that they're born into, and they expect that that's always how it's going to be. And they maybe are correct in some ways. I mean, a lot of the stuff has been around for like so long that it'll outlive us. That's again for the sociologist in me, that's that inertia that I was talking about, that things are going to go in a certain direction unless people push back against it. That what anarchists practically usually engage in, like their ongoing work or organizing, is about creating alternatives typically. On one hand, that try to do things differently in that egalitarian way, that cooperative way, that pooling of resources, the sharing, the, you know, kind of showing a different path forward. And on the other hand is the more oppositional approach that says we have to stop that other stuff. It's one thing to create an alternative, but it's another thing to say we have to stop that other stuff from happening. People who see that climate change, you may not agree, you know, with the science, but like what harm is there in fighting, like trying to create a better world, right? So what harm is there in trying to slow down something that there's clear evidence that is going on? Or when there's violence that happens, you know, when a police officer shoots or kills somebody, or, you know, when mass numbers of people are laid off or unemployed, or right now with the pandemic, that people are at risk of losing their apartments, because they can't afford rent. It's in those moments that anarchists say, yeah, we can create alternatives. We can envision and try to small in micro ways create better alternatives, but we also have to push back. And so anarchists have typically involved themselves in doing things like tenant defense committees, where they come and they, like a sheriff comes to like kick someone out of their apartment. They line up in front of the door, they link arms and they say, sorry, these people have lives. Their rights matter. They shouldn't be kicked out. They're going to starve. They're going to be exposed to the elements in the wintertime. You just shouldn't do this. And they make an immoral argument as well as actually a physical blockade to it. Anarchists have historically been involved in the labor movement. One of the kind of the more memorable labor unions in the past was the Industrial Workers of the World, who didn't, unlike other labor unions at the time, allowed women in. They allowed racial and ethnic minorities in, allowed immigrants in. They organized not just people who had kind of professions and occupations that were like crap jobs, but unskilled workers, anybody. They said we should all be together, all on the same page. We all work for a living. We should all rise or fall together. And that kind of solidarity led them to engage in wildly optimistic and probably ill-fated like attempts, right, to fight against their bosses. And lots of people died in the process of it through strikes and state violence against them. On one hand, anarchists are trying to create those alternatives. On the other hand, they're saying the alternatives, they can only really grow and flower into fruition when we stop this other terrible stuff happening, when we push back against it. So some of the alternatives will often look like what we call mutual aid societies, where people create just kind of the space or the organizational infrastructure to do things in a better way. There's hundreds of these now across the United States since COVID happened, where in communities all over the United States, I mean, sometimes there's only like a couple people, like 2 or 3 people involved. Some of them have like thousands of people every day participating in them. I mean, it's all kind of scales. Everything from doing what, the government would sometimes do with unemployment insurance, like, people who are donating extra money to give other people money to pay for their bills, doing things like what food shelves do, or doing things where they pick up people's kids after school or something like that and help people out who don't have.
Wasn't there some stuff done
Right.
around some of the wildfires there?
Yeah, I mean, I live in California, where very nearby there was a devastating fire 2 years ago that
This is
basically
in
destroyed the
Paradise.
town.
Paradise.
Yeah, the
right.
town of Paradise. President Trump went there to visit. It had 25,000 people living in it. Most of them now live in the city that I live in. So the population size increased by 20%. All those people live here now, mostly. In the aftermath of that, it's amazing what people can do when they see the need for it. And I think this goes across the board. This has nothing to do with ideology at this point. I think there's something innately human about us being able to see pain in other people. I mean, psychologists talk about this, that if you can see pain in other people, there's an empathetic response, empathetic in that we mirror those things. When you see people cry, most of us feel like crying ourselves. We take on emotions. I mean, this is one of the things about us as animals, that we are empathetic and we're mirroring creatures. And so across the political spectrum, and it had nothing to do with conservatism or radicalism or liberalism or anarchism, but it was amazing what happened in Chico after that. I mean, almost every driveway, it seemed like, had an RV parked in it, like for people who were like now refugees of that city. Almost every large major shopping mall or strip mall or even church parking lots had piles of clothes in it and like little mini like giveaway centers. There was a huge tent community that popped up in the Walmart parking lot, where probably about 1,000 people lived. And I was part of a mutual aid organization that helped them to, at one point, raise their tents off the ground because there was going to be some torrential rain. And so people, spent, entire days and weeks working in this community when they didn't have to do that. They weren't necessarily affected by the fire themselves, unless insofar as that they were community members and they felt the impulse to do it. We do this all the time with people we know. We do with family and friends and so forth. And when you see enough need around you, people will react and will respond to it. If I could recommend any book, I don't know if this is the kind of podcast.
Yeah, that's fine.
Books, but
we can do it.
if anyone wants a really great book to read, for years I was looking for a book like this. There's a wonderful book written by a woman named Rebecca Solnit, Solnit, and it's called A Paradise Built in Hell. And it's all about the ways in which really wonderful human relationships flower in the shadow of tragedy. Everything from like the San Francisco earthquake to 9/11 to Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. That in the midst of terrible stuff, like it's amazing, but the best in humanity can come out. And in a sense, what it does is it's almost like there's this cloud around us all the time, and all of a sudden there's this thing that kind of blows the mist away, and you can sort of see this new existence that's always been kind of back there, this potential that's always been there, but we've never sort of had the opportunity to pursue or to live. Like it's as if we discovered muscles in our body or our brains that we never knew we had, and all of a sudden we start using them, and we're like, this is wonderful. I was in when I was in the 1990s, I was going to college. I was a college student, and there was a really big flood that happened in the city that I lived in. The Red River of the North that flows into Canada and Hudson Bay flooded when all the snow melted, and I think like some 90% of the city got flooded. I spent a number of days with people basically sandbagging, like filling up big sacks with sand, stacking them in front of people's houses. I didn't know anybody of those people's houses. And in fact, I spent entire days with people that I didn't even know their names, but I felt incredible empathy and solidarity. And I felt like any one of those people would have done the same thing for me. It's amazing that when there is crisis, we usually respond. The problem is that usually the crisis is fairly quiet, or we can ignore it, or we can say, oh, it's only happening to the people over there. I don't know any of those people. What could I do anyways? So we can let it go on. I mean, every day in America, there's those mini tragedies and crises happening, but they're not happening in our backyard. But when we do see them, we usually feel compelled to act. I mean, many of us, right? Especially when there's enough pressure to do so. And I think that's what anarchists talk about when they refer to the term mutual aid. There's another Russian anarchist named Peter Kurpotkin, who was a social scientist, a geographer. He wrote probably one of the most famous anarchist books called Mutual Aid. He looked at how animal species cooperate with each other. Even like other bird species will sometimes like chirp, even if other birds are around that they have no connection to other species to warn of predators. Mammals, fish, there's all these ways in which they cooperate for group advantage, not individual selfish advantage, but group advantage. And he wrote the book as kind of a counter argument against social Darwinism. I mean, he was a total Darwinist. He believed in evolution, right. But there are all these social scientists, including some sociologists, who said, well, people are selfish, and it's about competition of the fittest, and those are the ones who are going to survive. Kropotkin says, no, if you look at human history, the people that have survived are people who are part of communities who defended themselves. I mean, sometimes against the elements, against nature, but also against like invading hordes, or poverty or fires or whatever else it might be. But those are the people who survived, not the people who like barricaded themselves alone, in their house, maybe with their families or maybe by themselves, and only were looking out for themselves. They'll run out of food, but the community will find a way of sharing food. They'll find a way of getting more food, right? And that's one way in which I think, kind of classic conservatives like can maybe see a little bit in anarchism they might like, about individualism, about empowerment, about freedom and so forth. But at the end of the day, usually conservatives will end those ideas at the family. And there's nothing wrong with like loving and respecting and defending your family. That's kind of what families do. The problem is to say that, well, what about for families who can't do that for themselves? What about other people who don't really have families? What about those other families who are on hard times? Should we only really protect our own? Or do we also have an advantage in helping them too? I mean, if you live in a neighborhood where there's a poor family living on your street, ultimately you may benefit, like even in a selfish sense, by you helping them out. I mean, it would make them less desperate, and maybe the little kid won't turn to like, robbing a house or something, because you help them out. And at the end of the day, it'll make you feel better. You'll be stronger. They'll have your back when things come around. Most people who are in poverty in the US like end up, they come out of poverty at some point and someone else goes in poverty. So many of us have these experiences that we think about them as only happening to us, and we are the ones that have to overcome it. But so many of us go through these things. And what would it mean for us to really have each other's backs? And it's in those moments of crisis, I think, where we see that most clearly, like our human potential. When I was in this town, sandbagging for days on end, it was the first time that I ever hitchhiked. I mean, like this pickup truck rolled by, and I was with these two people, one person that I'd known for a few months and someone else who I just met that day. They said, hey, do you need a ride? We were like 2 miles away from where we lived. We didn't want to walk. We said, sure. And I felt no worry or no fear about it. I mean, can you imagine how wonderful that would mean to not be afraid of people?
No, I got you. No,
You know, I mean, but that speaks to like what you were saying about trust. Like, how do we get to that point of trusting more?
yeah, well,
It's symbiotic, right? I mean, and that's what anarchists will say about that better society, that increased trust is necessary for a more anarchistic society.
well, it's in our
But anarchistic
self-interest.
societies will also create more trust.
Yeah.
I mean, it's this thing that will mostly mutually reinforce itself. And so how do you do it? You just make an intervention. You have to do it now. There's no other alternative to doing it.
Yeah.
You can't wait for the right moment. You can't wait for it to happen. You can't just lick your finger in the wind and say, oh, it's not right. I can't do it right now. We can always do something. And a lot of times people do things for years on end before they actually, mature into something that actually has a bigger impact.
Gotcha.
But most times it's by building organizations. It's by working with your neighbors, people who you know, and trying to do the right thing, living up to your values and just doing things.
Yeah. There are two other areas I'd like to talk about, then we'll call it a night if that's okay. But one's kind of personal, so I hope I'm not. How do you go? So for the folks that'll listen to this, you were an Eagle Scout.
Yeah.
You were an Eagle Boy Scout. I mean, I don't know anything more Americana than that in some ways, right? So how do you get from that place to this worldview?
Yeah. I think like a lot of things, there's a lot of ways to answer that. Some of them make a lot of sense, and some probably only make sense in a very unique way just for me, for my life. In a very broad and general sense, like the Boy Scouts are part of a general tradition of people joining organizations and doing things together. And some of those things are very good. Volunteering, doing things, there's a certain level of conservationism, environmentalism, mutual community support, supporting each other, things like that. And those are the things that I was attracted to. There's also problematic elements of it. It's kind of paramilitary-ish in a way, not like militias are today, but in that, they're organized into troops, and patrols, and it kind of mirrors in a sense the military system of the kind of organizational chains of command and stuff like that. I mean, but for kids, and some of that could be really bad, I guess, but some of it are, fine and benign, I guess. There's a certain level of religiosity that I think also exists in it, that also is part and parcel of America, that I was never a big fan of, but I mean, like a lot of anarchists, I'm willing to tolerate insofar as it doesn't negatively impact me and other people, I mean, as long as it's not forced on folks. The more personal argument I would make is that, I mean, I'm a kid, and I'm involved in things, and I know people that are involved in Boy Scouts. I'm like, sure, that's cool. Camping, that sounds interesting. Doing things with friends.
Well, yeah.
The patrol I was part of was pretty cooperative. We actually made like a totally ridiculous name up, and we didn't have like an actual patrol leader. We made it very egalitarian. We were very much, I think, I wouldn't say anarchist at all, or even anti-authoritarian, but we're very dissident oriented, I think, in how we presented ourselves.
Well, I guess I'm asking though, like,
how do I get from there to
yeah? So I mean, when do you start reading this stuff? Did you run into somebody who saw the world this way, and like, I mean, to the point that a big part of your career now is in this area?
Yeah.
I
think there's two different trajectories. There's one that kind of takes an evolutionary standpoint that says that you can find kernels of this stuff everywhere. You could find, I mean, I found kernels of anarchism in a Boy Scout troop. You could find it in nature. You could find it, all sorts of places if you want to. There's more of a revolutionary position that says that there's the need for a very sharp break from those other institutions, that you have to reject them and you have to replace them wholesale. I kind of fall in between. I think a lot of American institutions can be changed or reformed, and I think there's other ones that have to be scrapped, and the sooner the better. We could go through a laundry list of them, but for me, I mean, I, like a lot of people, I mean, my evolution made sense. I mean, where I am now makes a lot of sense to me, and I couldn't imagine another way of growing up that wouldn't have been different, that would have been better. Or sometimes hardship or like having those experiences helps you to know not only what you like about something, but also what you don't like. And I think that's good. There's a really interesting novel called The Dispossessed by a science fiction writer named Ursula Le Guin, where she talks about two societies, an anarchist society and a non-anarchist society. And the non-anarchist society has problems too. And it's often because that things are so perfect that people don't even know, they don't even know how good they have it sometimes, or they don't even know how, or the kind of, there's an incremental creep of problems. But since you believe so much in this pure world that you've created, you don't see those problems. Sometimes like it does take the perspective of like these terrible things to see what's wrong. Um, I have huge problems with the Boy Scouts of America today. I don't go around bragging them an Eagle Scout, but I also don't lie about it and say I'm not either. Like a lot of people, I think people are informed by their childhood experiences in good and bad ways. A lot of my experience in the Boy Scouts were pretty benign. They're good. I know that's not the case for everyone. There is a history of, like a lot of big institutions, there's some sex abuse stuff in Boy Scouts. I never saw any of it, but who knows, you know?
But I don't want to pick on, I don't want to pick on the Boy Scouts. I'm just, I find
some of it. Yeah.
You know, we all have these kind of weird journeys, right? Like, how do we get, and there's probably no explanation for them, but it is interesting.
We could do a total aside about the Boy Scouts. I mean, the Boy Scouts appear in that period of time where the frontier is closed and they appropriate large amounts of American Indian knowledge. A large part of their identity is also about creating healthy boys with pure practices and identities. And so there's this very, I mean, not to get too, you know, deep, I suppose, but there's things that mirror fascism in some of that too. The idea of clean mind, clean body, clean spirit, and so forth. But there's also good, I mean, you can interpret it other ways too. They're very positive. I mean, the Boy Scouts they're like everything, that they're a complex consequence of lots of stuff. Some good, some not so good. You know.
Well, can I switch, because we almost had the segue to the second part I was going to ask you. So
go ahead.
We just witnessed this week what some are calling almost a legal coup d'état. You know, where 100+ state reps and a number of state AGs backed this suit that Texas kind of took to the Supreme Court to basically overturn the elections. Now, the conservatives are saying that there was a liberal coup, that the election was rigged and so forth. 74 million people thought Donald Trump was a great idea for another 4 years. We're going to have kind of Joe Biden, neoliberalism, another round of that, it looks like. So how does an anarchist perspective view what just took place, in addition to, you know, I always say Trump is a symptom of something larger. So we've seen an increase in, you know, whether it's Boogaloo Boys, Proud Boys, alt-right, and conservatives are going to say, well, Antifa, as if they're comparable. Tons of registered voters still don't vote, right? We got to choose between two evils, one less than the other. Two white men, right, in the age of diversity. What does all that look like? As well as kind of where we're headed.
Anarchists tend to view elections with concerned pessimism, that they're opportunities to organize, in a sense. They're opportunities to take people's attention and to focus it on things that they think are important, which is usually not the elections themselves, but it's issues or big problems in society. There's a small number of anarchists who vote. Many think it's not super important at the end of the day. I mean, anarchists aren't that great in number, at least self-identified anarchists. And to be totally honest, we should probably acknowledge that people who vote shame in the United States, I mean, no one person has probably ever cost, you know, anybody, any presidential candidate, the presidency. It's a big, huge thing beyond any of our, you know, capacity to even understand how complex it is. So I think anarchists usually say, okay, vote if you want to, or don't vote, but don't make that be the only thing that you do. Don't either vote or not vote. Do something else, because either voting or not voting isn't going to solve the problems in society. You can't either vote and assume that's going to solve problems. You can also sit back and not vote, either as a protest or otherwise, and assume that things will solve themselves either. Anarchists usually argue for doing other things. And sometimes, you know, in tandem and kind of working against the electoral system, kind of working as sort of its doppelganger, kind of arguing, critically against it, or working it kind of as a wedge to kind of talk about main issues or things like that. I think most anarchists, though, probably, I would say most anarchists that I'm in communication with, that this probably was one of the scarier elections in terms of what America kind of feels like right now. And I think the society is artificially tearing itself apart. And I would say, I'm using the word artificial, maybe not, it's not maybe the best adjective, but it's what's happening is not anything that's necessary. It's complete hysteria, most of it. The problems that face us are not ones that yelling about or tweeting about are going to solve anything. They're just problems. And the hysteria. I mean, the people who are walking into the streets, we're recording this in kind of mid-December right now. Just a day or two days ago, people were walking around in Washington, D.C. with baseball bats. Proud Boys were threatening people. They were going to churches and ripping down Black Lives Matter signs. The idea that we're at that level of seriousness is scary, I think, for people, not just anarchists, but it mirrors other things and other points in human history too that I think we're very concerned about. But so much of it is it just seems so artificial. Like, the point of bringing people to that point is one of, it takes so much work. It takes so much work to convince people to be that angry, that upset, that frustrated, that disaffected. And also, I think that aggrieved feeling. Because a lot of those people, to be honest, are white men. And for people like us who have things pretty nice for the most part, to feel that like our society is being stolen from us, taken from us, that other people are winning and therefore we're losing. We have to be brought to that point. That's not like a natural reaction we have. Many people can very easily in conversation with each other say, yeah, that kind of sucks, or yeah, that's kind of bad, but like, let's go grab baseball bats, people have to be brought to this point. And there is demagogues out there. There's bigots. There are people who are organizing people to do these things. And this is a constant kind of demagoguery in American history. And they use those strategies against abolitionists. They used it against people fighting for women's suffrage. They used it to rouse up lynch mobs, to attack people organizing labor unions. They used it against people who were refugees, to kind of point fingers and say, those other people, those are the ones that are stealing from you. Those are the ones who are robbing. They're the ones who are a threat to your life, your marriage, your family, your values, your whatever it is. And those people, I think, they really honestly feel it, but you can work yourself up into a frenzy if you want to. It's totally possible. You can sit in a room and watch a scary movie or angry music, and you can feel things, and it's real. And those people have been brought to that place, and it's been sustained, not just by a few demagogues, but by rich, deep pockets of money who know that they're using these people as basically a wedge to fight against really a bare minimum of progressivism in society, a bare minimum of decency. Like deep pockets of money who are very cynically using them. Libertarians, like the Koch brothers or the Mercers, who have really no interest in a lot of the ideology of the alt-right, but know that the alt-right can be used to like reduce taxes. Right. If the alt-right can be used to get Republicans in office and they can reduce taxes, that's all they care about. That's literally all of it.
Yeah.
And I think that's the scary thing, because in the process, all of this energy is being used to divide people and to make us hate, to make us distrustful, to cause problems, and all sorts of violence too. And I think people are very concerned about the Proud Boys and the alt-right, and very reasonably. But on the other side, from the other perspective, people are being used or are being motivated to despise this phantom called Antifa, which, it's kind of like hating an ideology. It's kind of like hating, it's like hating rock and roll or something. You can hate rock and roll if you want to, but you can't fight it. It's not like there's a rock and roll organization out there that's trying to engage in a coup. Antifa is just a shortened version of anti-fascism. It's an idea. It's a practice. It's a set of principles, and that's it. There are anti-fascist organizations out there, but they're in the bare minimum. When people come to like oppose, when there's like a Klan rally or something like that, and anti-fascists show up, there's a couple organizations that may call themselves Antifa, but not many. And those organizations, by the way, are very egalitarian. Most of them are pretty anarchist, and they don't have leaders. No one is in charge of it. The idea that there's manipulation by a puppet master or that Antifa just has leaders that all that the state has to do is arrest them is ridiculous.
Well, this was one of the claims I heard that repeatedly by conservative folks, that Antifa is an arm of the Democratic Party. Like it's funny, right? Because it's, again, it's clear, you don't know, and at the same time,
so if you don't mind me interrupting just for a second, for your viewers, people who may be tuning in thinking that Antifa is an arm of the Democratic Party, let me say, as someone who, I'm not a member of an Antifa organization, but I identify as someone who's opposed to fascism. I mean, I hope that most of us are opposed to fascism. I hope even people who don't like Antifa can agree that like Nazism is bad. And if we can't, then I don't want to talk to you. There's no point in engaging. But let me just speak as someone who identifies with those ideas. It's not the same thing as the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party in the United States is like sort of a coalition of liberals, centrists, and conservatives. I mean, the Democratic Party is sort of like on the center right in most European societies. I mean, it's a narrow view.
I joke and say they're the Republican Party of the 1970s.
Yeah.
But at the same time, conservatives argue that liberals are the true fascists, in terms of political correct culture, in terms of the rigged election, in terms of pushing socialism, and
well, to maybe
you know what I mean, like.
Yeah, well, let's take a swing at that for a second and just take a look at maybe some of the issues that popped up in recent years, say about like transgenderism and trans rights. People who say that it's political correctness to give transgender people greater rights or freedoms, or to call them by certain pronouns or their names. I mean, okay, you can call that whatever you want to call it. I mean, you can call it roast beef, you can call it a Cadillac, you can call it whatever label you want to. But if all it really is about decency and respecting someone, then what is political correctness except just sort of asking that people respect each other? If we really don't, I mean, again, political correctness or PC has been like this kind of this mean buzzword since the 90s. And I think people attacked it because at the end of the day, like these like ultra conservative right wingers kind of thought that like PC culture would actually lead us to being nice to each other and care about each other more. And if we could hack away at that, then okay, that's great, right? Oh, you're not PC, you don't care about people, you're just being PC, you're making me like say things. Well, I mean, if I asked you to call me Michael, or if I asked you to call me Maria, I mean, at the end of the day, you might say, well, why would I do that? But if I ask you to do it, I mean, most people would say, okay, fine. He wants to be called that. We'll call him whatever he wants to be called. What's the problem in that? And you could say, well, that's PC, right? Because like if him calling himself, asking me to call Maria is like, that's advocating gender fluidity or whatever. Like, no, it's just asking for decency. I mean, is that really all the PC is? Well, then why are we even arguing about this?
But I wonder, I think the issue for a lot of folks is that we're not talking about people. I asked Tom this earlier, in a corporate capitalist setting where we're all resources anyway, right? I joke about this, but I really think it's true. Like there's a part of me that thinks we all kind of need rehab from consumer capitalism. We need to detox from, we wouldn't even know what that world looks like, right? Because we've, it's in our bones. Particularly if we grow up here, and as well as kind of whiteness and who's really valuable, whose lives matter, women and men. It seems to me that when you have these ideological systems in place in a culture, they produce folks that just simply that aren't empathetic, that do not experience, and the process of othering somebody. That's what words like socialist is, or it's a dehumanizing psychological tactic to say you're not one of me, right? And then I don't have to feel, I don't have to be decent because you're not human.
I've had to think about that stuff in recent weeks and months too. I mean, I'm absolutely not a supporter of Trump. I mean, I find nothing beneficial about him. Although, I mean, lots of people do. And I have to check myself all the time and say that there has to be something good in those people, though. I mean, I know there is, right?
Yeah,
I mean, many of them are very wonderful people. In fact, people that I know who are supporters of Trump, And in the context of my relationship, they're wonderful people. I mean, we don't necessarily talk about politics, but you can see the humanity in them. And I hope they see the humanity in me too. That's the problem, I think, like you were saying with ideology, is that it forces us into these camps and says, oh, okay, conservatives are opposed to liberals, liberals are opposed to conservatives.
It's
And
very us
granted,
and them,
I'm neither.
very us and them.
Yeah. But at the end of the day, we're people who have needs, and but we're in a society where we don't have them met necessarily. We're not guaranteed them. So anarchists typically argue that we can't really rely on major institutions to do things because they're run by elites that have their own interests, their own motivations, their own inertia. But we can do things, and we can do them together. And that's why the kind of early 18th century anarchists or 19th century anarchists, they actually had a great claim to saying that we could carry out a revolution, and because we're the ones who do everything. Like all the things that are necessary for society, workers do. We don't really need any of those people who call themselves leaders and who demand respect. We don't really need any of them. It's not to say that they need to die or go away, but those jobs are not necessary, right? We know how to grow food. We know how to make things. We can repair things. Those are things that are in our capacity. So the thing that's stopping us from doing it are these ideas of I own it or you don't own it, or that I'm deserving and you're not deserving. Or that you're against me, right? And therefore I shouldn't cooperate with you, or I shouldn't trust you. These things are toxic. And I have a hard time struggling against it because I see people who cheer when Trump says, build the wall. And I mean, I have students who are from Mexico. Some of them are undocumented. They totally deserve an education. They deserve where they're living. Anyone should be able to live where they want to live. I mean, the idea that those people shouldn't be able to live their lives, that they should be forced back to like their home country, perhaps, where they're going to be victims of violence. Many of them fled, what is the drug war. I mean, that's why there's so many people who are in the United States who are from Mexico and recently been fleeing because of all the violence there. There's violence in Mexico because the US drug war makes it profitable to traffic drugs through Mexico. It's our fault. It's America's fault that that's happening. But I mean, I want my students to, I love my students, and they have relationships with other white people too. And I think for the most part, we can see our humanity. So when I hear people chanting, build that wall, and it seems very xenophobic, I mean, it hurts me. But I know that at the heart that those people have fears, and that that's being motivated from a very dark place in their lives. Some of it is because they had pain, that they had been traumatized, and maybe not, probably not by an immigrant per se, but by other people. And they're very susceptible to being manipulated too, right? And I feel for them in the same way that I feel for people who are victims of other kinds of atrocities and crimes. And I think bad things have happened to people, and that's why people resort to that demagoguery. That's why I think those ideas are that's why they're susceptible to believing them.
Well, and I think this is where like my struggle with liberals, and having lived in one of the most liberal cities in the country, is I see them other conservatives.
Yeah, sure.
And reduce them. I mean, the comedians, the liberal Colbert, Trevor Noah, like, well, and there's this contradiction too, where Trump is a problematic person as far as I'm concerned, for a variety of reasons, but so he's criticized for making fun of people's bodies, but then people make fun of his body.
Yeah, sure.
There is this thing going on, and I think the other thing I've struggled with is liberal folk. We're all kind of politically segregated. I asked Tom, and I've asked other people this. I've said this. I think liberals are much more dependent on conservatives than conservatives are on liberals, just for what you said, because most folks who make everything happen, that make our lives go, whether it's plumbing or construction or putting a roof on a house or producing food, many of those people are conservatives
in different ways, but yeah. Socially or economically or whatever. Not always, but some.
Yeah. I would say, at least here, disproportionately, the people who make everything operate are politically conservative. So
it depends on probably what you're talking about, in what way we're conservative, or there's social conservatism, there's economic conservatism.
I'll just say, Republican.
Yeah.
And I know that that's not one thing, but
Yeah.
um, where do you see all this going?
Yeah. Um, I was really disappointed like 4 years ago when Trump got elected, and the main response from people was, we have to replace Trump, as opposed to look inward and say, why did Trump happen?
Yeah,
I don't care one bit about Trump at all. I mean, I think he should be opposed and fought. He probably deserves to be in jail, but um, I don't really care about him for the most part. I'm really concerned that lots of people liked his ideas. That's what bothers me. Even though a lot of those people are very nice in many ways, I'm really concerned about why those ideas are so appealing. Is it because he stuck it to the liberals? Is it because he made fun of them and like their lifestyles in cities, or like their preferences for pronouns or whatever it was? I mean, or is it because he he made them feel things, right? And sometimes anger is important because it's an emotion that we lack otherwise. Anger is a really easy emotion. And if you're not in a really joyful situation, or you're not in a place that is really happy, anger is a really amazing way to feel something. It's very catalyzing. Is that what it was? And I'm really disappointed that most of the reaction in the United States, especially the Democrats, of whom I'm no fan of. I mean, I'm not a Democrat. I don't vote
yeah,
for the Democratic Party.
I'm right there with you.
Um, that that the reaction with Democrats was, well, let's beat Trump, as opposed to thinking about, well, why? And it's not to say, well, let's meet conservatism halfway either. It's not to say, well, okay, let's peel back our idea of universal health care or something, or let's shut the border down just like Republicans wanted to do, or maybe Trump, because not all Republicans want to. Many Republicans are open border people because it benefits capitalism.
Yeah, cheap labor.
But let's ask the question, like, why did that happen? And let's understand, why is it so easy for a fast talking salesman, an oil salesman, snake oil salesman, who, I mean, that's again what he was. I mean, he was overwhelmingly a TV personality who can sell things. He sold us on ideas. He sold himself on himself. It was bluster. And why are so many people swept up in that? Why are so many people um, entertained by him as a charismatic personality, as a celebrity? Why are they so interested in
Don't you
obeying
think a
his
lot of
ideas
don't
as
you
an
think
authoritarian figure? I mean,
yeah,
like, he's an authority. I mean, like, why obey? I mean, those are the things I think are worth asking, as opposed to, some kind of political question about voting or something like that.
right.
I mean, that runs deep in America. The authoritarianism is deep there. The celebrity, the worship of individuals is very big. Um, those are deep-seated problems that I don't really know an easy fix to. Um, I don't know.
Yeah, the Democratic response has been fascinating to watch, and it's been difficult to talk to my liberal friends, whether it's Russiagate or we're going to get him this time, or the fact that the media outlets, particularly liberal ones, have just made an industry out of outrage, as has Fox.
Yeah.
For years, right?
And to be fair, like, the media, I mean, a lot of the media is politically united against Trump. He's not wrong.
Yeah.
But there's a symbiotic relationship
Oh,
too.
absolutely.
They sell newspapers, they can
Yeah,
place ads in cable news because of him,
yeah,
because he's so polarizing. People love him and hate him,
yeah.
and that sells.
Well, it's
And I think
wrestling.
that's the problem.
It's
The fact
wrestling.
that there's money being made on this.
It's
Like, it
wrestling.
shows that it's a game that other people are losing through the playing of it.
Yeah. Well, and I think the thing that concerns me the most, I think it's fascinating that conservatives have lost faith in the intelligence community when leftists have always been questionable about the FBI and right.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, well, welcome to the, welcome, I think that,
or that you can't trust the CIA,
yeah. That,
or that the Democrats are the defenders of the CIA. It's
right.
like,
right. But I think
and
what is sociologically speaking, just the amount of lack of faith in social institutions is terrifying to me.
Right.
Yeah.
And
I don't
on
see
one hand,
that being
it's
repaired.
terrifying.
Pardon?
Yeah. On one hand, I think it's terrifying, but on the other hand, I think there's great potential in some of it too. It's terrifying. At the same time, there's good things that could perhaps come out of it.
Well, this
Like
this is
if so many people, I mean, so that's the question of the revolutionary element of anarchism, is that to really supplant these big institutions, you have to cut yourself off from trusting in them. So the fact that, like, I mean, America, like for instance, like one of the institutions that has the lowest trust is probably the U.S. Congress. Like, I mean, somewhere around like 7 or 8% of Americans say they have a great deal of trust in the Congress. 7 or 8%, like almost nobody, in other words. I mean, it's different for other institutions, but on one hand, I think that's really wonderful because it means that we should find answers and solutions elsewhere. Of course, the Democrats and Republicans are pushing people all the time to renew their faith in it, right? And I think that shouldn't be the case. I mean, you can get more for your life investing yourself and your energies in a community organization in your town, right? That will benefit you and your neighbors more than like showing up to vote, and casting a ballot in like a 5 minute, not, dropping in the ballot. I think that's an illusory effort. I mean, there's so many better opportunities of investing your time and effort than that. So on one hand, I think it's perfectly fine to lack faith in them because they don't deserve trust. They don't deserve faith or confidence. But if you're speaking about in general, like people are generally distrustful of everything, yes, that is absolutely problematic.
yeah.
I've done a little bit of research myself as a sociologist, writing about what I call the intersection between social and political trust. Political trust being trust in major American institutions of power, and social trust being just trusting each other. On one hand, there's lots of people who trust both. They trust political institutions and they trust each other generally. Those are kind of what we call liberals, I guess. There's other people who are totally distrustful of both. Maybe some of the people who might be Trumpists are kind of like that, but they're also not quite the same, I think. Those are people who are just generally paranoid and cynical and pessimistic about things. Those are people who are kind of disenfranchised or cut off. It's white and black and Latino. It's people of different economic strata. And then the other way in which I think we can understand this interestingly is there are people who politically trust, like they trust those institutions, but don't trust each other. That's the fascistic authoritarian stuff with Trump, I think, that I'm afraid of. But there's also another opportunity too. There's people who distrust those political institutions, but trust each other. Those are very much the libertarian socialists, the horizontalists who say, let's not put our faith in those big institutions that are operating in these hierarchical ways. Let's just trust each other. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter what Congress says or does. What matters is if my neighbor has my back. That's what matters a lot more at the end of the day. They're the ones that are going to help me if I have a fire. They're the ones who are going to lend me food if I need help. They're the ones who can watch my kid or I can watch their kid. Those are the ones who matter. But you're absolutely right. Like there's many people who fall in that distruster category. They don't trust anybody or anything. That's scary because I mean, they could very easily be pushed into the camp of those authoritarians. All it takes is a little bit of an appealing person in power like Trump to say, okay, you might not trust the CIA or the police or the Congress, but trust me. And it's amazing that Trump was in power for 4 years, totally rejecting all the institutional power that he had at his fingertips. It boggles the mind. Like he has the largest organization in the world, the most powerful, the wealthiest at his fingertips, the most violent, and he thinks it's against him. It just boggles the mind. But I would love to see those people who are in the distruster category be shown another way of trusting their neighbors. Fine, keep the political distrust, but start to see the humanity in your fellow peers. And you can start pulling people into this more egalitarian way of operating. It's a challenge, it's a struggle, but like, what's the alternative? I mean, voting for people?
No,
So
I know. I guess. Well, I also find it ironic when everybody on the left and or liberal and conservative complain about the government that we fund.
Yeah.
Let's just don't fund it. Let's
Yeah.
talk about defunding the federal government.
Yeah.
Would be. I guess the concerns I have is that we are a hyper individualistic culture and society now. I'm not sure movement models of the past where you have movement building that's sustained for long periods of time, which was never perfect. I'm not, I don't know whether we can come together,
I don't know either, but I mean, I think for anarchist people who have sort of chosen those ideas as the best ones, but not kind of say, well, that's the only possibility.
Yeah.
It is in some ways a leap of faith, and it's also kind of a realpolitik weighing of, well, what's the alternative? I don't know. I don't know what really the alternative is. I mean, part of it is a very nihilistic rejection of any hope. Um, and I mean, just as a generally optimistic person, I would just reject that, not because I necessarily believe in great revolutionary potential in the future, but just that I choose not to be pessimistic because it'd be hard to get out of bed in the morning, you know. And I'd rather live in a more optimistic world where I hope things could be better. And I'm not disappointed. I mean, every couple months I see amazing things that people are doing, and it feeds me a bit. But yeah, at the end of the day, I mean, there's lots of evidence that things don't always get better, or maybe are always or regularly not getting better, and maybe even getting worse. Um, and that's like some kind of big existential, philosophical debate we can have about what's the place of pessimism or optimism in society. At the end of the day, like to have a functioning society, even a really unequal, violent one like ours, you have to have a little bit of optimism. I mean, even a little bit, because otherwise, what's bad will get worse if we're more pessimistic. So I think sometimes it has to be just like through force of will. And anarchists, I think, have sustained movements like that over the years. And every now and again, there's a revolution that kicks off that's fairly successful, or new movements come that do dramatically shift society. Usually not creating a revolutionary utopia, but dramatically making things different and better. And often for the long term, not indefinitely, but often for the long term. And I mean, social change is really, really long. And that's what King argued, right? That like the arc of
Moral arc of the
history
universe.
it's long, but it bends towards justice. I don't know if that's true, but I agree with the long part.
I think it bends, it gets bent.
Yes, people bend it.
That's
right.
That's what I would amend to his profound comment.
And that's probably what he meant too, because he was an active social change agent. I mean, he and anonymous hordes of people basically fought and died for decades trying to bend it in one direction in ways that today most people wouldn't reject. I mean, even people who are on the alt-right are very careful in how they talk about civil rights, oftentimes even embracing it in the abstract.
Yeah.
I mean, even
no, there's definitely been change. Like one of the things that I remarked about on conservative talk radio recently, I was just listening, and folks were talking about gay couples in a very acceptable, non-judgmental. I was like, holy cow, this is real different. The show before that comment was made was about the therapeutic uses of psychoactive plants, and I'm like, holy cow, so change does happen.
And I completely agree, and those are great examples. When I first started teaching like 15 years ago or so, I mean, if you brought up like homosexuality in a class, I mean, there was just widespread snickering. I mean, within a few years that didn't even happen. And I mean, universally, I mean, most people don't reject the idea of gay marriage. I mean, it's like some of that happened overnight. And I think on one hand, like it is change that people were convinced either of it being possible, right? And so started believing in it more and pushed for it. Other people were converted to the ideas. And oftentimes that's because their neighbors, their family members came out to them and said, hey, my gay uncle or my lesbian sister or whatever, like, do we really not want more for them, But it's also, to be totally honest, that change happens just because time moves on. And younger generations are born more open-minded and older ones pass on. And so change will incrementally, demographically change sometimes. And you can't stop it, right? So it's going to change one way or the other. I mean, but people like King said, well, you should push. Well, it's happening. To the extent to which you can't control everything, you should still make a case for it. And that's why I think anarchists often have gotten the rap of being naive or utopian philosophers, that you talk a lot about these ideas, but you don't seem to have a big impact. Anarchists would probably disagree and say we've had a big impact, often changing values in the society. But even at the end of the day, like being a strong voice for the place of values is an important place. Like so my students, I mean, when I talk to my students, I'm very careful to say that, you're my student for the semester. We're together for 4 months. You don't have to call me by my official title. You don't have to call me Dr. Williams or Professor Williams. You can call me Dana if you want to. Just don't call me Hey Yo or something like that. I mean, just let's be respectful of each other. You taking this class kind of, it assumes that you've kind of accepted to do some work in here, but at the end of the day, I'm not going to tell you that I'm smart and you're dumb. And most importantly, at the end of this semester, we're going to revert back to how we were before, which is just that we're fellow humans. The nice thing about being a professor is that built into it is self-subverting authority. My authority only lasts insofar as I know a few extra things. And as soon as you've got that knowledge, I mean, all my authority goes away. And even if that doesn't happen, at the end of the semester, it goes away too. And so that's the part I really love about my job. And I think that there could be so much more of that in our relationships, of just kind of respecting each other and their differences. And if we don't talk about these values, we won't see those things. I mean, if we ignore them, or if we kind of just talk about the grind, or if we just complain, or like you were saying, liberal comedians kind of complain about Trump. If we don't talk about what the alternative is, so what? If all we do is say Biden is great because he's not Trump, then we're not talking about the ways in which Biden isn't great. And there's lots of things that are totally not great about Biden.
Absolutely.
And even if Biden was great, there's some politicians that I think are way better than Biden. But at the end of the day, should I really trust them to make decisions for me? Should I really put, the running of a society in the hands of like a small number of, to be totally honest, elite people?
Millionaires.
Who are good talkers, have deep pockets, right? And are persuasive. And by the way, are total egomaniacs. Trump's not the only narcissist out there.
Oh, no.
Everyone who runs for president, by definition, has to be a narcissist. You think that you're the only one that has the solution to America's problems? You are a narcissist.
Yeah, I don't trust people that want to run for office. I think we should find people that, have a proven track record of being upright, moral, and convincing them, recruiting them to run.
There's an anarchist named Brian Martin, who is a social scientist in Australia, actually. And he argued for a number of years ago this thing called demarchy, running kind of by the demos model that the Greek kind of pantheon did. And of course, like you can say, okay, Greek is unequal, it's imperialist, it's slave owning, patriarchal, but how they ran their government was basically by lottery. Well, you want like average everyday people there? Pull names out of a hat. You want people who understands how things work? Don't pick people who are good talkers. Don't pick people who are egomaniacs who think that they know how things work. Pick everyday people, and you'll find a collection of smart, bright, and sometimes not so bright people. Some people are open-minded and some not so open-minded. That's a representative body of society. He said, if you want to have people in power, that's the only good way and moral way to do it. You don't give it to people who want power. That's the wrong solution to the problem. At the end of the day, they believe, I mean, almost in like a savior sense. And even if we want to speak theistically, that's problematic, right? That we're going to put all of our faith in someone to save us. Anarchists say, no, we will save ourselves. And not just, I will save myself, we will save ourselves.
Sounds like a good place to stop. Man, I appreciate you doing this.
Yeah, I love you, Mark.
Yeah, I love you too.
Thanks for chatting with me. I always love chatting with you.
Yeah, we always have a good conversation. And I wanted people to get to see who you are and get to hear some of these ideas. So thanks for making time.
Yeah.